Of course, it wasn't Garrick's Jubilee alone that made Shakespeare's reputation. However celebrated Garrick was, there had to be a wider cultural movement to turn Shakespeare from any old dramatist into the greatest genius the world had ever seen. It so happened that Garrick's Jubilee coincided with the early years of the movement that we've come to know as Romanticism. This was a European-wide movement that originally took root in Germany, then spread to Britain, whereby there was a new fascination with the creative arts, with nature, with the supernatural, with everything that went against the quiet rationality that had dominated much of culture in the 18th century. The great writer Goethe imagined contrasting the classical architecture of the Parthenon in Athens with the Gothic architecture of the great European medieval Gothic cathedrals. And in a sense, the shift from the classicism of the 18th century to the Romanticism of the early 19th century was just like that, a shift from the harmonious, the classical, to the wild and the Gothic. And so it was that certain aspects of Shakespeare, his supernatural plays, for instance, Macbeth, The Tempest, Midsummer Night's Dream, his fascination with the madness of his characters, his sense of passion, these things became increasingly central to the perception of his work. First in Germany, then in England, creative writers took to the example of Shakespeare. Germany had a very strong sense of being in the shadow of French culture, French classically influenced culture. And a number of German writers, Goethe and Schiller, notable among them, decided they really needed to create a new kind of distinctively German drama and poetry. And in order to do this, they looked to Shakespeare. After all, Shakespeare was very different from the French writers. He didn't have classical restraint. He mixed the wild and the passionate. He mixed classicism with Romanticism, high characters with low, tragedies with comedies. It was possible to extract from Shakespeare something that the Germans could make their own. And so it was that a national drama began to emerge in Shakespeare, using the model of Shakespeare's drama, of his own nation's history. In England, meanwhile, poets became increasingly introspective, interested in the idea of the imagination itself. And those imaginative plays, whether it was Macbeth with the witches and the imaginary dagger, whether it was Hamlet brooding in a melancholy way on his own character, these were of enormous fascination to English writers such as William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and Lord Byron. All of those writers tried to write plays, and their plays were very closely modelled on Shakespeare. To be honest, not many of them worked very well on stage. Shakespeare was hard to match in terms of dramatic writing. But the spirit of Shakespeare went into the odes and lyrical poems of the Romantics. Shakespeare also began to influence the novel in the Romantic period, whether it was Gothic novels that took supernatural elements from plays such as Macbeth, or historical novels such as those of Sir Walter Scott. It was a difficult time in Scottish history, the early 19th century. And Sir Walter Scott, the great novelist of the age, set about writing about his own nation's history. And like the Germans before him, he used the example of Shakespeare's history plays as a way of exploring national identity in his own Scotland. Scott came here to Stratford to visit the grave of Shakespeare. And this is an imaginary portrait of him standing in reverent silence in front of the gravestone and the monument that was erected on the walls of the church by Shakespeare's family. Scott is here paying homage. He's as if in silent prayer before the God of his imagination. Sir Walter Scott's novels, using the example of Shakespearean history as a way of creating great imaginative stories about Scottish history, had huge influence across Europe. As each new nation came into being, they looked to Scott and to Shakespeare to give them models of what a national poet, a national writer might be like. Sir Walter Scott and Lord Byron were the two most celebrated writers in 19th century Europe. They were both obsessed with Shakespeare. Their own works were deeply influenced by Shakespeare. And it was through that influence that many writers across Europe came to Shakespeare and saw Shakespeare not as a poet who belonged to the Elizabethan past, but as a living force, creating new work in the present, inspiring romantic writing, whether in the theatre, the opera house, the novel, or in poetry. This portrait of Sir Walter Scott here in Stratford, in reverent silence in front of the tomb and monument of Shakespeare, is a wonderful symbol of how in the Romantic period of the early 19th century, Stratford became the epicentre of a cult of Shakespeare that was European and that was soon to be genuinely global.